Hello there, and welcome to Black Her Stories, a platform that celebrates the creative power of Black women throughout history and in modern times. I am your host, Michaela Ayers, and the creator of Black Her Stories, which was birthed in 2019 as a community event in honor of Black History Month, my favorite time of year. Through conversations with visionary leaders, we elevate the impact of iconic women whose names are too often erased from history books. If you've been following me for a while, then you know that I've studied the culture of Black womanhood in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. I've dipped my toes in the cool waters of literature and the arts. But this season, I'm ready to do things a little differently. So instead of focusing on just a single career path, this season of Black Her Stories will focus on mothers and honor the women who care for communities, nurture families, and lead organizations. Why? Because Black history simply would not exist without Black mothers. And the archetype of mother is one that is woven within all of our stories. To add a little bit more flavor to the mix, this season you'll also be hearing from the community of people who are inspired by Black women. Which brings me to today's guest, Jahmad Canley. Jahmad is a husband, father, community member, and the president of Potential Unleashed, a business coaching and consulting firm that specializes in cultural transformation. Now, I've had the pleasure of being in community with Jahmad since the early days of my entrepreneurial journey, and I have learned so much from his example. Over the years, we've had many conversations about equity, anti-racism, and belonging, but have never had a chance to discuss the impact of Black women on his life, a topic much closer to home. So sit back, friends, and relax, and let's dive into my conversation with Jahmad Canley. Tell me a little bit about a Black mother who really inspires you.
You know, it's tough. I go between my grandmother and my mom. I'll choose my grandmother just because my grandmother also helped shape my mom, who was shaped me as well. And my grandmother and I were very, very close before she passed.
I'm curious about her leadership. Like, what did you notice about the way that she led her family or led in her community?
Yeah, my grandmother grew up in Jim Crow, Tennessee, and eventually moved here to Washington when she and my grandfather got married. He was in the military and came to Fort Lewis. One of the things about my grandmother is that she was very strong and did not believe in letting anyone taking advantage of her, did not believe in cowering to anyone for any reason. And so she came off sometimes as really rough around the edges. And at the same time, just the sweetest person that you could ever meet, right? And so I would say one thing about her leadership style that I've learned is that my grandmother was a very social person, but also to herself in a sense, almost like a social introvert. But it was amazing to me how in the community, everyone who knew her felt like they were her favorite person. I remember about a week before she passed, I had a random encounter with her at a grocery store. As I was walking in, she was walking out, and we're stopped and we're talking. I'm like, Grandma, let me help you with your groceries and everything. And she said, actually, my legs are tired. I think I'm going to sit here for a while. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to sit here with you. And so we sat for probably an hour and just talked on this bench in this grocery store. But what was so cool, as we sat there, all of these people from the community are walking in and out of the grocery store. And it's like she knew everyone. And everyone would stop and say, oh my goodness, Miss Davis. And she would say, oh, this is my grandson. And she would tell me about this person that either she used to work with, or they used to live down the street, or they used to play with your mom and your uncles. And Again, because I knew her so well, it was also amazing to me because I'm like, my grandmother didn't really like do people like that. Right? But, but here she is knowing half of the grocery store and everyone's so excited to see her. But that was a part of her leadership. He also believed in letting people make their own decisions, but giving you guidance and advice. She's going to let you bump your head and learn throughout the process and also be there to help you pick up the pieces.
Well, thank you so much for bringing your grandmother into the room. And I think there's a few things that I noticed and I'm curious to learn more about, like that discernment of like time for me and time for others, to be able to navigate that and hold both. I think is such a gift, like I identify as an introverted extrovert. And so I hear a little bit of that in her as well.
Definitely.
And I'm curious because you're in leadership development. And so I want to know, how does a style like that, like what is unique about that when you think about looking outside, like the culture of leadership? What do you notice about that that's unique?
I think our dominant society for years has told us that leaders have to be loud, extremely vocal, that you have to always lead from the front, that we have a bias towards extroverted leaders. And I find that to be very far from the truth. Some of the most dynamic, impactful leaders that I've met, that is not who they are. And when they lead through their authentic self, they have such an amazing impact. I coach leaders around finding your authentic voice because what I found is that so many great leaders were showing up the way that they thought they had to show up because of the bias. And so I think that has a lot to do with leadership today, that when people can really tap into who they are and not try to change and adjust just based off of the norm, that they get to show up in a better space, they have more energy left for themselves, which allows them to lead and do the work in a different space. They don't burn out as fast, right? Like I talked to so many leaders, and it's not the work that's burning them out. It's sometimes having to show up as someone who they're not. And that was something that my grandmother just, she never had this desire to be who she wasn't. It was like, this is who I am, this is who I am. You're going to like me, you're going to love me, or you're not. But this is who I am. And I think that's one of the things that people loved about her was just she was always authentic.
Mm. Yeah. It's resonating with me on a lot of different levels. And I think the thing that I'm holding on to is the beauty of age, like being around people who are older, like having a lower tolerance to be somebody else, right? Confident in themselves, self-assured, I've never met a grandma who's trying to be somebody else,
Right.
like not one. And I think that also what you're sharing around the dominant culture narrative of leadership is this archetype of extroverted, assertive. It conjures a specific kind of image and behavior. And so through these conversations, what I really appreciate is drawing out all of the different ways that leadership could look like related to relationships. I was also, as you were sharing, I was thinking about listening being something that I really value as a trait of leadership about myself. People really long to be listened to. And when you take that time to listen to them, I think that's what I hear in everyone thinking that your grandma was her favorite person,
Yeah.
just giving them that space to share whatever they needed to share.
Absolutely. Again, I was shocked and amazed who told stories of how when their parents wouldn't listen, they would go and speak to my grandmother. Or when they needed wisdom, they would go speak to my grandmother. Because as you know, so often people really don't need advice. We need someone who will actually listen to us and let us work through our thoughts. And we often can come to our own conclusion and our own decision, but it's having that space where someone is actually listening to us. And she was really amazing at that.
It's a beautiful gift that we can offer each other in terms of those kind of safe spaces. This season of Black Her Stories, I'm focusing in on motherhood, but I see now, and I imagine more and more, it's going to be grandmotherhood, this kind of larger figure in a lot of ways. And so I'm curious what you notice in terms of how does her imprint impact your work? Like, how are you carrying her legacy, her leadership into what you do?
Yeah. One place I would start is confidence. My grandmother believed in me, and sometimes that was enough to help me believe in myself, right? I don't know that I would be doing the things that I do without that. And not just my grandmother, both my parents as well. But again, there was those times where you're just at certain ages, and my parents always told me I could do and be anything that I wanted to be. And they're also my parents. And so they also want the best for you and, want you to maybe not take as many chances. Right. And so there were things that I would think about in my head. And sometimes I would go talk to my grandmother about those things. And her thing was always like, give it a shot, but make sure ... And that was extremely helpful for me. I carry that with me even to this day. It's something that I'm trying to really instill in my own children is that confidence to take the shot, go after it, move to Detroit, right? Like go do those things, and those things that we carry in our minds, manifest those. And I got a lot of that from my parents and my grandmother, of just that confidence to be able to do that. And so often I could just throw something out to her, just in passing. We'd be talking about something else, or I'm over at the house doing something. And I just go, "So, Grandma, I'm thinking about this." And she would just go, "Well, baby, I hope it works out for you." And that was all I needed. It was almost my own bias of like, I'm going to go run this by Grandma, because I know Grandma, no matter what, is going to tell me she supports me. So I'll be like, "Oh, that's all I needed. Thanks, Grandma."
Totally, totally. Those affirmations are so important just
Yeah.
to get the thought out of your head and then also have it reflected back as valuable. Like,
Yeah.
yes, do that thing.
That was huge. And I think that influences so much of my leadership today and how I work and how I move. I try things and I push past the fear that sometimes wants to creep in, because I think back to, okay, what's the worst that could happen? You know, and then not only asking that question, but actually processing through it and realizing at the end of the day, most often the worst that could happen is that you end up in the same place that you are, and that's stuff that I learned from my grandmother. Again, the stuff that she navigated in her early life and all throughout life. I never once heard her complain about racism and Jim Crow. Now, what I mean by that is she talked about like what that was like, but I never once heard her complain in the sense of, and it stopped me from this. It would be a part of the story in the narrative, and a very real part of the story in the narrative, and she did it anyway. So she had to navigate things differently, and she did it anyway. And that's something I take with me of like, okay, this is an obstacle that I'm dealing with, but I'm not going to let it stop me.
Wow. Well, I appreciate like confidence, yes. But I think I also hear this boldness and this creative thinking too, in terms of like, not going to let anything stop me. And then the ... Like, what are the other steps that I could take to get me closer to that thing, given the circumstances, given the resources I have? And I think that's something about the culture of Black womanhood that I
Mm-hmm.
noticed just over time, right? Making something out of nothing, not letting the obstacles stand in the way of what that self actualization could be for that
Mm-hmm.
person at that particular time. And so I think that to me is at the root of that kind of creative power that we all have. But I really appreciate hearing through these types of stories.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about your grandmother. It was really lovely hearing a little bit about her. What was her name?
Betty Davis. Betty Joe.
Betty Joe.
Yeah.
Well, what a delight to learn about her and get to hear about her impact on your life and her story. So thank you so much, Jahmad.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for this work that you're doing.
And this is the work that I love to do. Sending deep gratitude to Jahmad Canley for joining us in this episode. Thank you for introducing us to your grandma, Betty Joe Davis. Now, if you are looking for fresh and creative ways to engage employees, bring Black Her Stories to your organization. I'm clearly biased, but I believe that BHS is the perfect audience engagement program that highlights relevant stories that demonstrate the value of leadership and professional development. Delivered virtually or in person, I deliver dynamic sessions that harness the power of storytelling to solve problems and build community. So let's make a plan for Mother's Day, and don't forget about Juneteenth. Head on over to nourish.community to get in touch. This episode of Black Her Stories was written, produced, and edited by me. Our music is by Chris Sims. All right, y'all, that's it from me. Thank you so much for watching and listening. And until next time, please take good care.